Chapter 2, Part 3. Samuel waited in Gibeah while the Philistines encamped at Michmash. King Saul returned to Gibeah and held court under the shade of a tamarisk tree. When no Israelite army came out to meet the Philistines sent out raiding parties. Ophrah was attacked, then Beth Horon. Soon after, they plundered the borderland overlooking the valley of Zeboim, facing the desert. Samuel returned to Ramah. Saul waited for a sign from God or a word of encouragement from the prophet. None came. He grew more sullen with each passing day. His army of 600 sank into despair. Abner and the other leaders gave advice, but Saul didn't listen. Numerous plans were laid out and then rejected. The king seemed incapable of action. Worse, he became suspicious. Send someone to keep watch over Samuel. If he goes anywhere, follow him and report back to me. Samuel prays for you, Father. So you say, but can I trust him? He said God would choose another. Reports came in that the Philistines were on the move again. Jonathan heard all the talk and kept his eyes open. The inactivity wore on him as much as it did the others. What was this? What war was like? Long weeks, sometimes months of waiting, and then the terror and exhilaration of battle? The Philistines took cruel delight in raiding when and where they pleased, for King Saul sent no one to stop them. Jonathan's father could not get his mind off Samuel's prophecy. Something had to be done to rouse the king and the men of Israel. Something had to bring them together, as they had been when the Lord gave them Jabesh Gilead. Jonathan prayed, Lord, help me. I don't want to make the same mistake I did with Geba. If Jonathan did anything, he must do it alone, so the blame would fall only on him if he failed. A Philistine detachment was camped at the pass at Michmash. Jonathan knew the area well. The slippery, thorny cliffs of Bozez and Seneh faced each other. But there was one place above, barely a furrow of land, where one man could hold ground and kill a score of Philistines, possibly more. Jonathan might die. So be it. Better to die in battle with honor than to live in fear of idol worshippers. He rose, shouldered the quiver of arrows, took his bow, and left the city. Ebenezer grabbed Jonathan's shield and his own bow and arrows and ran after him. Where are we going, my lord? To see what the Lord will do. The boy stayed at his side, but Jonathan wondered if he would be brave enough to follow all the way. When they were away from Gibeah, Jonathan faced Ebenezer. Let's go across to the outpost of those pagans. Perhaps the Lord will help us, for nothing can hinder the Lord. He can win a battle whether he has many warriors or only a few. Ebenezer's eyes brightened. He grinned broadly. Do what you think is best. I'm with you completely, whatever you decide. Jonathan laughed. What would the Philistines make of the two of them? When they reached the cliff opposite the Philistine encampment, Jonathan surveyed the gap between them and the enemy camp. Lord, send me a sign that you will give those men into our hands. He felt a quickening, a flush of heat rushing through his veins, and a yes, go rush of confidence. Jonathan pointed. All right, then, we'll cross over and let them see us. If they say to us, stay where you are, or we'll kill you, then we'll stop and not go to them. But if they say, come on up and fight, then we will go up. That will be the Lord's sign that he will help us defeat them. Either way, they would fight against God's enemies. One way would bring certain death, the other victory. Ebenezer nodded. We can hold them off as long as we have arrows, my lord, and then you have your sword. Jonathan gripped the boy's shoulder. Whether in the gap or on the cliffs, the boy was as willing to die fighting as he was. Jonathan descended first, setting the pace. Slipping once, he caught hold and regained his footing. Watch it there, my friend. Move to your right. That's it. When they had both reached the bottom, Jonathan moved out of the shadows into the open. He planted his feet and lifted his head. Ebenezer joined him. Look, a man laughed from above. The Hebrews are crawling out of their holes. Other Philistines joined the watchmen. A few warriors peered over the edge of the cliff. One spit. Their laughter echoed between the walls of the cliffs. Jonathan's heart beat hard for battle. Lord, please give them into our hands. Let them know there is a God in Israel. And the sign came. Come on up here and we'll teach you a lesson. Come on, climb right behind me, for the Lord will help us defeat them. Jonathan ran up the cliff and started to climb. at the cliff and started to climb, Ebenezer right behind him, grasping hold of thick-rooted thorn bushes. Jonathan pulled himself up. He found footholds and climbed like a lizard on a fortress wall, trailed by his younger armor-bearer. Still, laughing, the Philistine warriors moved back from the edge of the cliff. Jonathan could hear them. When he reached the top, he walked forward and took his stand. He grinned at the surprise on the Philistines' faces. A couple of boys. John, one of the Philistines drew his sword, both about to die. Ebenezer took his place near Jonathan. One of the Philistines guffawed. In one fluid motion, Jonathan shrugged the bow from his shoulder, whipped out an arrow, set it, and sent it straight and true to its target. The laughing Philistine fell back, an arrow between his eyes. Stunned, the others stared at Jonathan, and one of the Philistines drew his sword. And then let out a battle roar. He drew swords and came at Jonathan and Ebenezer, who shot one arrow after another, and one after another. Philistines fell, 20 in all. The shouting had roused the others. More shouting came from behind. With his last arrow released, Jonathan drew his sword and gave his battle cry, "For the Lord!" The ground shook as the Philistine warriors panicked and ran. Jonathan ran into the confusion and hacked down an officer. Ebenezer grabbed a spear and threw it into a fleeing Philistine. More screams rent the air. "The shofar blows," Ebenezer cried out. "The king is coming." Jonathan shouted in exultation. Israel was on the move. Philistines ran in terror. Jonathan spotted a few Hebrews among the Philistines. Whether they were men who had gone up to fight with the enemy or were captives did not matter now. "Fight for Israel or die," Jonathan shouted, and the men turned as one and fought for Jonathan. "The ark," Ebenezer shouted. Jonathan looked back and saw the ark. No! With a roar, he turned, enraged at the thought the enemy was getting their hands on it again. He ran into the Philistine camp, swords flashing. "No one will ever take the ark from us." He cut to the left. "No one will open it and desecrate it." He cut to the right. "No one will take the law from us." He slashed and stabbed. "No one will open the jar and spill out the manna." He sliced off the warrior's arm and cut off his head. "No one will break the staff of Aaron that sprouted leaves, bloomed, and bore almonds in a day." Jonathan screamed in rage as he fought. "Jehovah Roy, El Shaddai, Adonai, God is our king, God is almighty Lord." The Philistines ran from him in terror. From all directions the Hebrews came. The king's army of 600 swelled and advanced north from Gibeah. Men of Ephraim pressed in from the south. Confusion reigned among the Philistines. Some fled toward Ajalon, others to Orpha, trying to reach Bethaven, their stronghold, the house of wickedness. Taking up a spear, Jonathan kept after the Philistines, encouraging the other Israelites who had joined him. They grew weary and faint. They were barely able to keep up with him. When Jonathan had entered the woods, he spotted bees swarming over a hole in the ground. "Honey!" He reached out the end of his staff, dipped it into the hole, and brought a portion of the honeycomb. God provides. He ate and felt his strength increasing. Men stopped and watched him, but made no move to take any of the honey. "Eat!" Jonathan looked around at them, perplexed. "What's the matter with you?" He dipped his staff again and held it out to them. "The honey will strengthen you." "We can't. Your father made the army take a strict oath that anyone who eats food today will be cursed, and that's why everyone is weary and faint." Jonathan went cold and then hot. "My father has made trouble for us all. Would he have to die for eating the honey? A command like that only hurts us. See how refreshed I am now that I've eaten a little bit of this honey? It's a gift from the Lord. If we eat it, the king will have us killed." He pressed them no further. His father would excuse him, but he would not excuse others. If men had been allowed to eat freely from the food they found among our enemies, think how many more Philistines we could have killed. All the Philistines would have been dead before the day was over. Jonathan turned away and continued the chase. Those who could followed. From Michmash to Alahon, the Philistines fell. Many escaped because Saul's men were too exhausted from lack of food to follow after them. When the Hebrews came upon sheep, cattle, and calves, they fell upon them, slaughtering the animals in the field and cutting away chunks of flesh, their mouths dripping blood as they ate to satisfy their ravenous hunger. The priest cried out, "Stop what you're doing! You're breaking the law!" The men did not listen. Saul built an altar and ordered the men to bring the animals there. "Kill them here and drain the blood before you eat them. Do not sin against the Lord by eating meat with blood still in it." "Do not sin against the Lord," the priest ran, echoing the priest ran, echoing the king's command. "You must not eat meat with blood still in it." Sickened, Jonathan turned away. It was too late to undo what the men had done. Anxiety spread through the camp. The men who had followed Jonathan came to him. "We will say nothing of what you did in the forest." Jonathan was troubled by their fear. Did they really think the king would kill his own son? Would he? Could he? Saul summoned him. "So you disobeyed me again?" Jonathan's stomach was a cold knot of fear. He felt sweat break out on the back of his neck. Had someone told the king about the honey? The king's advisors looked at Jonathan, their expressions close and watchful. "You go out to war without my leave?" Jonathan lifted his head. "God gave us victory. You might have been killed. What did you think you were doing going out against the Philistines with only your armor bearer? Where is he?" Saul looked around. "Why isn't he at your side?" "He's asleep." Jonathan bared his teeth in a forced grin. "It's been a long day, father." Saul laughed and pounded Jonathan's back. "My son, the warrior," he looked at the men. "He climbs the cliff and kills more than a score of Philistines, all better equipped and more skilled than he. And he sets the entire Philistine army on the run." His eyes glowed as he looked on Jonathan. "You bring honor upon your father, the king." Jonathan saw something dark in his father's praise. "The panic that came upon the Philistines was from the Lord, my king. It's the Lord who rescued Israel today." "Yes," Saul pounded him again. "The Lord." He smiled at the others. "But we've kept them running, haven't we?" He went to a table and unrolled a map. "Let's chase the Philistines all night and plunder them until sunrise. Let's destroy every last one of them. Think of the wealth it will bring me." Jonathan thought that unwise. The men are exhausted, and now that they've eaten, they'll sleep as though drugged. Saul glared at him. "The men will do what I say." "And perish for it." Jonathan held his tongue, hoping the advisors would speak sense. Instead, they all agreed with the king. They said exactly what Saul wanted to hear. "We'll do whatever you think's best. We'll go after them and be the richer for it." Jonathan looked at Ahijah. "Shouldn't we inquire of the Lord?" The priest took a nervous step forward. "Your son shows your great wisdom, my lord. Let's ask God first." When the others agreed, Saul shrugged. "Should we go after the Philistines? Will you help us defeat them?" Ahijah placed his hands over the Urim and Thummim and waited for God's answer. Saul stood silent. The men waited. The Lord did not answer. The night seemed darker to Jonathan. Even as dawn came, he felt no lifting of his spirit. The sun rose and moved slowly across the sky, and with it, in the echoing words of the soldiers in their woods, "Your father made the army take a strict oath. Anyone who eats food today will be cursed." Jonathan bowed his face to the Lord. "Lord, I took no such oath. I knew nothing about it. Am I still bound by it? Do you refuse to speak to the king because I sinned? Let it not be so. Don't let me again be the one who brings disaster on the people." When he rose, he sat back on his heels. He knew what he must do. Abner intercepted him. "What do you think you're doing?" "I must speak with my father, the king." "And confess about the honey?" "You know—" "Yes, I know. I know everything that happens among my men. I have to know." He pulled Jonathan aside. "No one has said anything to the king, nor will they. I've brought trouble upon him again." He made a hasty vow, Jonathan. "Should that vow cost the people their prince?" Jonathan tried to step around him. Abner blocked his away, eyes flashing. "Do you think the Lord would want the death of his champion?" Jonathan went hot. "The Lord needs no champion." Abner caught hold of Jonathan's arm, holding him back. "What glory would the Lord receive from your death?" When Jonathan turned away, he saw his father watching from the entrance of his tent. Eyes dark, Saul came outside and shouted orders. "Something's wrong." He looked at Abner. "I want all my army commanders to come here." The men gathered quickly and stood before him. Saul looked at each of them. "We must find out what sin was committed today." Jonathan was afraid. Never had he seen such a look in his father's face. The king's eyes burned with suspicion. Does my father now see me as his enemy? He felt sick. Jonathan and I will stand over here, and all of you stand over there. Jonathan took his place at the king's side. Would his father kill him? We want a king like the nations around us. Jonathan's heart began to pound heavily. He had heard stories about the surrounding nations and how they executed their own sons to maintain their power. Some even sacrificed them on the city walls to please their gods. Sweat broke out on his face. Will my father kill me, Lord? Not my father. I vow by the name of the Lord who rescued Israel that the sinner will surely die, even if it is my own son, Jonathan. Jonathan received his answer, but he could not believe it. No, he cannot have changed so much. He looked at Abner and then the others. The men all stared straight ahead, not meeting his eyes. Not a man spoke a word. Frustrated, Saul summoned the entire army. Someone will tell me. When the men were gathered, the king prayed loudly, O Lord, God of Israel, please show us who is guilty and who is innocent. Jonathan looked at his father. He didn't know what to do. If he confessed now, would his father break his vow or keep it? Either way, Jonathan had put his father in an untenable position yet again. Fear shook him, for no good could come from this day. The priests cast lots. Men in their units were found innocent. Jonathan felt his father's tension grow with each passing moment. Moisture beaded the king's forehead. Jonathan could smell the rank sweat of fear. He knows. He's afraid of me. He doesn't know what to do. He won't kill me. He loves me. He can't kill his own son. Saul held out a trembling hand. Now cast lots again and choose between me and Jonathan. Ahijah did so. He looked up relieved. It's Jonathan, my lord. Then his father's turned, eyes blazing. Jonathan was shocked to see relief in his eyes, even as they welled with tears of fury. Tell me what you have done. I tasted a little honey, Jonathan admitted. It was only a little bit on the end of a stick. Does that deserve death? Yes, Jonathan, Saul said. You must die. May God strike me and even kill me if you do not die for this. Saul drew his sword. Jonathan gaped, too shocked to move. No! Officers moved quickly between the king and the prince. Jonathan has won this great victory for Israel. Should he die? Far from it. Men shouted from every side. Abner spoke louder than the rest. As surely as the Lord lives, not one hair on his head will be touched, for God helped him do a great deed today. You cannot do this, Saul. Jonathan cringed. He saw his father's wrath evaporate. He looked this way and that. Finally, Saul slid his sword back into its scabbard. My hand will not be raised against my own son. He put his hand on Jonathan's shoulder and dismissed the army. As they walked away, Saul took his hand away and went inside the tent. Jonathan followed. He wanted to beg forgiveness. Abner and his advisors stood around him. Saul faced them. God has destroyed the wheat harvest, but the other crops will soon be ready for harvest, and the army needs provisions. He did not look at Jonathan. We will not pursue the Philistines. We will withdraw to our own land. Tell your units to break camp. We live within the hour. Father, not now. We'll talk later on the way home. When the army was on the move, Jonathan walked beside his father. I'm sorry. Sorry? Saul's tone was flat. He stared straight ahead. Samuel is against me. Is my own son to be my enemy as well? Jonathan's heart sank and tears welled. Had I known your vow, I never would have eaten the honey. Saul glanced at him and then looked ahead again. Jonathan, you were either with me or you are against me. Which is it? Never had words hurt so much. No one is more loyal to you than I. It may seem so to you, but if you continue to act on your own as you did in Geba and now in Michmash, you will split the nation. Is that what you want? To remove the crown from my head and have Samuel place it on your own? No! Jonathan stopped and turned away. No! Keep walking. Jonathan fell into step beside him. His father spoke again without looking at him. They all stood against me in order to protect you. Jonathan could not deny it. Men were easily swayed by an act of courage, but it was God, not he, who had brought the victory. I only meant to rally the men. And me? Had his actions brought shame upon his father? What could he say to make amends if that were so? Samuel said God had already chosen another king. Saul looked at Jonathan, frowning. Isn't it you? Crushed, Jonathan spoke, his voice choked with emotion. Father, no. You are the king of Israel. My hand will never be raised against you. Saul's eyes cleared of suspicion. He put his hand on Jonathan's shoulder and squeezed. We must protect one another, my son. Like it or not, our lives are in peril. Not just our lives, but those of your brothers as well. If anyone takes the crown from us, Malchusha, Adinabab, Ishabeth, and your sisters will be killed so that my line will be ended. Do you understand? It is the way of kings to destroy all their enemies, even the children that might grow up to come against them. He squeezed Jonathan's shoulder again and released him. Don't trust anyone, Jonathan. We have enemies all around us, enemies everywhere. It was true, Israel was threatened from all sides. The Philistines were along the coast, Moab to the east, Ammon to the north, and the kings of Zobath to the south. It seemed the entire world wanted to destroy God's people, and the fastest way to scatter an army was to kill the king. But his father seemed to think there were enemies among their own people as well. We will unite the tribes, Father. We will teach them to trust the Lord our God. Saul was looking ahead. You will be at my right hand, he kept walking. We will build a dynasty. Jonathan glanced at him. Samuel had said. Saul made a fist. I will hold on to my power. His arms jerked as he spoke to himself in a low, hard voice. I will hold on to my power. I will. He let his hand drop to his side and his chin went up. I will. And that's the end of chapter 2.